Welcome everybody who's joining us from near and far. My name is Maria Gaztambide and I am Director and Chief Curator of Public Art of the University of Houston System, as well as Lead Curator for the exhibition Instantaneous Beauty, Andy Warhol and the Photographic Process. Tonight's virtual conversation is organized in conjunction with the show. For those of you watching from Houston, Instantaneous Beauty is currently on view at the O'Kane Gallery, University of Houston downtown through April 6th, and it opens at the Art Gallery of the University of Houston Clear Lake on May 19th, running through June 24th. So you have two opportunities to see it live in person here in Houston. Joining me tonight is the celebrated contemporary realist painter Jamie Wyeth, with whom Andy Warhol formed a lifelong friendship and artistic collaboration. Jamie is a third-generation artist and a member of the famed artistic dynasty that also included his father Andrew, several aunts and uncles, as well as his grandfather N.C. Wyeth. Together, the family has chronicled American life since the early 1900s. Also joining me tonight is Vincent Fremont, the legendary filmmaker and producer who worked alongside Warhol at the factory for nearly 2 decades. Vincent later helped to establish the Warhol Foundation, and he was also closely involved in creating the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, guiding the selection of the founding collection. It is a true honor to have you both here tonight, and welcome.
Thank you.
Together, we will explore Warhol's work process and self, as well as reflect on the New York universe gravitating around him in the 70s and 80s, which was the time period that we focus on in the exhibition. And just a little housekeeping before we begin. We've planned a 45-minute conversation along with a 15-minute Q&A session at the end. For those of you in the audience, feel free to write down your questions at any moment on the Q&A chat box during the conversation, and we'll get to them towards the end. So Public Art's collection of 150 Andy Warhol photographs, both Polaroids and black and white prints, some of which you are seeing on your screens, were a gift from the Andy Warhol Foundation as part of its photographic legacy project. Vincent, I thought that since you were involved and you were founder and board member of the foundation, could you help me provide some context for the program?
Well, I was a founding director of the Andy Warhol Foundation with 2 others, Fred Hughes, Andy's main business manager and close friend, and one of his brothers, John Warhola. So by the time the Andy Warhol Photographic Legacy Program was created, I had resigned from the board of the foundation to become the exclusive agent for sales of Andy's artwork. So my job was to sell work so we could give money away. So I was not directly involved, but I was certainly aware of what was happening. I think it was an amazing project that went out, started in, I think, 2007, and they gave photographs and Polaroids to institutions around the country that normally would not be able to afford getting these great photographs and things. So it really spawned a lot of exhibitions, as we see here tonight, your exhibition. So I think it's a terrific. So I tip my hat to the Warhol Foundation, but I haven't been a board member for many years.
Thank you. As you said, it's really been an amazing treasure to be able to share with our community in Houston and communities across the United States that normally.
And the fact they gave the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford the contact sheets and negatives, which is another great resource, for people to learn about Andy and his world.
So, so why don't we start from the beginning? How did each of you meet Andy Warhol?
Jamie?
Well, I met him really through Peter Beard, the photographer. Brought me down to the factory, and we sat and chatted, and of course I absolutely was fascinated by him, that started a cataclysmic change in my life. I've been raised in Chadds Ford and grew up in my father's studio, had breakfast practically at his easel. My grandfather's studio was up the hill, so everything was totally Wyeth, and to end up coming to New York and working with Warhol was a cataclysmic change for me, and it still resonates.
What year was that Peter brought you to Andy's studio?
God, I just don't know the years. It was 70 something, 70.
Yeah, it had to be early. I would say it's early. Well, it could be 73, 4.
Yeah, about that, I would think. Exactly.
Yeah, because or when we moved to 860 Broadway.
Yes, it was at
Yeah,
860.
so we moved to 860 Broadway the summer of 1974, because that's what I remember in part. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And the great, wonderful building. I was fascinated by it, the space and so forth. And so I sort of created a studio there. When I asked him would he pose for me, he said yes. And so he sort of gave me a corner, as you probably remember, Vincent,
Absolutely.
with these huge black kind of things to sort of create my walls and whatnot. So I had a little world within the world of the factory, which is perfect for me because I just worked away.
And it was on the north side of Union Square. So where you work, you face Broadway and, and abutted 17th Street.
Exactly. And it was wonderful light and so forth. And so the factory continued running as I was sort of toiling away in my little corner.
I always remember you as the artist in residence because it was the first time we had smelled oil paint in Andy's studio.
Oh, yes, exactly. And it's just so it was an enormous change for me, and still resonated. And Warhol to me was sort of fascinating because he was sort of the bridge between abstract and realism, was sort of pop art, and so it was sort of right up my alley, and I, as I say, I submerged myself for over a year in this world.
Submerged and kept submerging.
Yes, exactly.
No, because I know Andy really liked you, as did Fred Hughes, and we all, liked you. And as I said to you earlier, that I was so happy when you gave all of us studies of your works of portraits of Andy. So my study you gave me says 905 Vincent. The profile, because I opened up the studio at 9:05 every morning approximately. So you're always the first one there.
And we're gonna see that one a little later on. It's I think that's such a funny story about that one. How about you, Vincent? You have this really terrific story about how you came to meet Andy Warhol.
I'm already talked out. No, I was a fan of Andy's as a young person in California, LA, and San Diego. I had, by the time I was in high school, Point Loma High School, myself and 2 other friends were big fans of Andy's world, following it closely from San Diego. And after graduating from high school in 1968, we formed a group called the Babies, went to LA, we were adopted into the GTOs by Miss Mercy. GTO stands for Girls Together Outrageously. We started dressing like musicians, and then we decided we had to decamp California and went to New York, August of 1969. We had an ersatz manager who drove us cross country. We arrived in Manhattan the weekend of Woodstock, if you can imagine, and checked into the Chelsea Hotel. That's the drill. Went to the back of Max's. We were let in immediately. My friends had been in New York maybe 6 months earlier, had met Andy. So maybe the second or third day, we went to Andy's studio at 33 Union Square West with, Mexican theatrical masks as a gift. And I had no idea of that afternoon when I spent a couple hours with him, and Andy was taping me and asking me lots of questions that I would become a lifer. So that was, August of 1969.
How old were you, Vincent, at that point?
18.
18, yeah.
And you stayed on for 20 years, which
Well,
was...
I freelanced in 69. I covered Old Calcutta, the first full frontal nude musical review in the East Village for Andy, because he was supposed to do something for Diners Club, and he certainly wasn't going to go down. The assassination attempt was roughly a year prior to this, so I went down there and did it. We wrote the piece together. But I came on board full time January of 71, because I spent most of 1970 getting out of the draft and raising money I had to go back to California to get out of the draft and raise money to come back to New York. So from the beginning of 71 on, I was a lifer.
So
I proudly say that.
what an amazing experience. I'm sure that people in our audience will want to know more about that. One thing that comes to mind when I think about Andy Warhol and this time at the factory is that he surrounded himself with obviously people like y'all, as well as hundreds of other eccentric and super interesting people, both at the factory but also outside of it. And I wondered if you could, but at the same time, he was sort of a very, seems to me from the outside as he was a very private person, like he was simultaneously at a center stage, but at the same time also kind of an anonymous social observer. Could you maybe talk about the sorts of people that he brought into his universe and what they brought to him?
Well, you have to break it down into decades.
Why don't we focus on the
Circle of Friends
70s and 80s?
Well, just to get back to it, Circle of Friends in the 50s, some of them translated into the 60s, and then the 60s with Silver Factory, some of that translated into the 70s, but for the most part, they were very kind of separate. The 70s was the beginning of a change because it's post the assassination attempt. It was more concerned about security and all the crazies coming around, but it was also the advent of the, drag queens who were coming, Candy Darling and Jackie Curtis, Holly Woodlawn. So that date, 71 was a change. If you think of the American culture, you take Altamont as kind of the marker, because post Altamont, the flower war, flower power, everything's done. All that the hippie stuff is destroyed basically. So it was a reemergence. And so I think that, Fred Hughes became, Fred and Paul Morrissey were Andy's managers, Paul for the films and Fred for the artwork. But it became a time where we had a dress code. We could wear jackets and ties and jeans. And I think Andy and Fred, if arguably, set that whole style, which is now, everywhere, or has been for 50, 30, 40 years. But it was just collecting different groups of people. Andy was the center of energy. So PR people brought people into Andy's studio. They brought rock bands because of the association of Andy with the Rolling Stones, obviously the Velvet Underground. So it's anybody from the creative walks of life Andy encouraged, and they came. Jamie, and you're included in that because here Peter Beard brings you into our world.
And I always, the few times Andy came to Chad's Ford, friends of mine would come up to me and said, I had the most interesting conversation with your friend Warhol. And I knew Andy's side of the conversation was, oh, really? Oh, really? In a way, he was sort of like a voyeur, and yet everybody was attracted to. And here he would just stand there in total silence. It just fascinated me.
Well, he was a great listener, and people, women especially, would feel like they had to pour out all their problems to him.
Yes, exactly.
So and of course, about their divorces, their love life, but he was a great listener, and by saying few words, he actually was he was, in the good sense of voyeur, he's observing. He was taking it all in.
Well, and many times recording it, wasn't he?
Yeah. Even though
I thought was fascinating.
Even when people said not to record, he always kept it on. Even
totally. Yes.
So a lot of his audio tapes are not good quality because they're garbled because it's too close. But he was just he loved documenting the time he lived, and that's why instant gratification, the Polaroid, the tape recorder, and videotape were all the mediums that he could use and really appreciated.
And I remember the kids in the factory transcribing this sort of hours of these sort of many times dribble conversations.
How could you say that, Jamie?
Did you do some of that transcribing, Vincent, or that was not part of your role?
Transcribing was for various people. I was an editor I had a column in Interview Magazine, a TV reviews. I did some interviews, but a lot of transcribing was for the interviews for Interview Magazine. Bridgette, by mid-70s, 1970 or 1976, when Andy asked her to come work full-time, Bridgette being Bridgette Berlin of Chelsea Girls and other films. She transcribed Andy's personal tapes, and he wouldn't bother to tell her what was on, who he tape recorded. And so she was spent the whole day. And it wasn't the content that he was, so concerned about. It was the stack of paper growing by the typewriter. It was very conceptual. He liked the idea that you could see stacks of paper with, words on it.
And are there not still at the Warhol Museum boxes and boxes that they haven't even opened?
No, they finally, I think they completed all the time capsules.
Did they really? Oh my.
Yeah, it took about 15 years, but or so more. But I'm pretty sure it's complete.
I've heard. I remember there was a big exhibition, and they had on the cover of the catalog a CD of Warhol talks, and there was lots of various tapes, and among it was he posing for me, and it was the Bryant wife who was came to interview both of us, and Sandy Bryant, wasn't that her name?
Oh, Sandy Brandt.
Brandt, yes, exactly.
Yeah, Peter Brandt's first wife.
That's right. And
but
so,
are you talking about that CD that was on the Andy Warhol Museum's initial catalog for
the initial catalog? Exactly.
Yeah.
Which were recordings, and among it was he and I talking about toys and whatnot. And of course, I love toys, and I found Warhol to me was fascinating that he was so childlike. There was a wonderful sense of wonder to him, which I think translated and why he still resonates today. I think he truly was in love with Liz Taylor. He truly was in love with Marilyn Monroe. And I think, these sort of Warhol wannabes, sort of like Coons and so forth, they're very sort of smart and calculated, but Andy really there was this wonder. He just loved these things. And if you're going to do one, do 500 of them. It was, I thought it was just so unique and fascinating.
Well, he did have an enormous curiosity of American culture. That's why he influenced it so much, because he really saw it in different ways. He saw things that everyday life so differently than anybody else, and but he would get in those philosophic moods in the afternoons and open up the New York Post or asking, why do you think somebody did something like that? Or he just posed all these questions. And again, it was how his process of thinking and creating. He really was this kind of visionary. So he was taking in how everybody was living very carefully, and in Europe as well, but primarily in the United States.
And it came across as a very authentic. His finished result was authentic, and I think that's another reason why people are drawn to his work still today.
Yeah, no, Jamie's correct about, he was, this picture we have up with Larry Rivers leaning in on Bianca Jagger and Jamie in the table, that was the lunchroom at 860 Broadway conference. So
it's kind of thinking about what was life like at the factory. This is a perfect example of the sorts of people that he would bring together. And just thinking for a moment about your experience at the factory, Jamie, I've heard you say that your artistic practice is tied to the places and the people that you know best, and that you need to kind of peel the onion of a person, so to speak, before you can paint him or her. And while you were at the factory, you made many, many, many exceptional sketches and drawings for your kind of final portrait of Andy, including, we mentioned earlier, Vincent's, the piece that is in Vincent's collection, which is the central image on the top row, in which you dedicated to Vincent as for Vincent 905, right?
I'd forgotten that, but I just incessantly drew him. I was totally immersed in it and just fascinated. I measured, I had calipers that I literally would measure the length of his nose and the size of his ear. He called them the torture tools, but he went along, let me do it. He sat there. I think if most people, if they were posing for me for a portrait and got up and looked at it halfway through and would have said, "Are you kidding? I'm out of here." But he just he sat, and and the portrait, the one life-size portrait, is pretty blunt and sort of deer in the headlights, and you know, I don't think he was that crazy. Somebody asked him what if he owned it. He said he would stick it in a closet, but he kept saying I was using too much pimple paint. He kept looking at my palette and saying, "Why are you using all that pimple paint? Get rid of that." So anyway, I just was totally and I just wanted to. I was obsessed. I mean, simple as that.
And I think he might have been obsessed with you too.
Well, I think we both had crushes on one another. I mean, you know, he was 20 years older than I was. He was interested in young people, and so it was a sort of a mutual thing. He said that with the portrait of me that he took more Polaroids, and I think that was just he saying it was a comment on how many drawings I've been doing. Because his work was click, click, you know, and then Vincent, who was the guy that did a lot of the silk screens with him, the blonde guy?
Oh, you're talking about the little one, Rupert Smith.
Rupert Smith, yes.
Yeah, Rupert Smith started out as master printer about 1976, 77.
Okay, right.
Before that, it was Alex Heinriche. Yeah, but when you said little one, I knew you meant Rupert.
Right. A very sweet person, I must say. I mean, there was this coterie of people, and I love the fact that Warhol acted like he hadn't even done the work. That in fact, I found him a feverish worker, but it was all sort of concealed and not even signed. Why he always signed on the back of the paintings? What was that all about, Vincent?
But I think for me, it's about composition, and he didn't want to have anything interfere, because when he worked on the, just to give you an example, which is not a painting, but when he worked on the Love You Live album cover for the Rolling Stones, Charlie Watts and Mick were involved with Andy going over all the things. And I sat down with him and we did drawings. And what the final product which was Polaroids that Andy took of all the band members biting each other. The album cover that Mick wanted to have the Rolling Stones, Andy didn't want to have any writing on it, just the imagery. And Mick prevailed eventually, but that's what Andy wanted. So anything later, if he was like making prints, he would sign on the front because the publishers wanted the signatures on front. And later, the 80s drawings, he sometimes signed up the side, but most of the time, all paintings, everything's on the back.
On the stretchers, yeah.
Exactly. Well, no, on the canvas, but then sometimes if he stretched it, you know, a lot of times things went out unstretched. So sometimes the signatures are upside down, you know, in the wrong.
Right. Yes.
And sometimes he'd forget to sign them.
Right.
But general practice was nothing was signed until it was sold and going out to studio. But unfortunately, a lot of times he forgot to sign things that went into exhibitions.
So for our audience, I'm showing everybody out of the multiple drawings, Jamie, that you graciously made available to us for the exhibition. I picked this one. It's called Back to Cranky. And I feel it's quite special because you captured kind of a private, almost vulnerable man with his back turned to us and kind of comfortable enough with you that he's showing you not his artistic persona, but his true self. And I thought it's a wonderful, beautiful drawing. Thought I'd share it with our audience. But you mentioned the final portrait, which here it is. And like you said, it captures a kind of a startled Andy Warhol. And I just wondered, how did you come to select this particular, out of the multiple drawings that you made, how did you come to select this particular kind of frontal view of Andy with Archie for the final work?
Well, it wasn't really the final work. I mean, I continued working after this. This was just one of the, and happened to be in oil and so forth. So it wasn't really working up to a portrait. But I wanted the image of him to, I mean, it fascinated me because here was this image of Warhol and with the blonde wig and the makeup and the so forth that he spent tremendous time working on. And it was the time when the press really discovered the word art. And so he kind of fit into a rather peculiar looking person. Let's zero into him. And it was an enviable position because behind it, he could work like holy hell on himself, you know, just working, drawing, doing things and so forth. But out there was this sort of image. And so by doing him just point blank deer in the headlights was, you know, I just wanted to record just exactly as I felt he looked.
And on the flip side of that, what was it like for you to have Warhol at first photograph you and then paint your portrait? And here we're showing 8 of the Polaroids that we have in our collection of you kind of documenting that process. What was that like?
Well, it was just, I mean, he would direct you to put your hand up here, I mean, they're all very glamorous photographs. But this was completely directed by him. And Vincent, I was rather fascinated. Not that many years ago, I went to some exhibition and there were lots of drawings that he'd done of me, which I had never seen before.
Oh my God, you never saw them.
No, I mean, he gave me one huge drawing, but I
Yeah,
mean, God, there were like 15 of them. I was
they were
just
done on they were done on HMP paper with graphite. They're beautiful, actually.
right. Yeah,
I don't
like
know how many we had some after Andy died. I think there were 3 or 4 or 5, 6 that were in the estate and foundation, which went to exhibitions. But I think they're amazing, and I think your portrait was really I can tell that he cared about you.
well, it's sort
The
of
classic pose with the hand on the chin. I mean,
yes, exactly. Well, I miss him. You know, the sad thing is that he's not still around, because I think he would have been a wonderful old man. I mean, he had such a sense of curiosity of the world, and it still makes me very, very sad.
and he encouraged young people. That's what that was something that was really very important to him. I mean, look at the studio. If you look back in the 70s, all of us working for him were in our 20s. Fred would being the oldest at 26 or 27.
Yes.
We were all early 20s, and he gave us positions that we had to learn how to fill. And
It's whole responsibility.
I was made vice president of Andy Warhol Enterprises at the age of roughly 24. So, and I always say, people ask me what my education was. I went to my answer is I went to the University of Andy Warhol.
Yes, exactly. Fascinating, just anyway.
And Jamie, Andy, there's this quote that I found about Andy that he says, in thinking about your portrait, he says, I took more pictures of him thinking of you than anyone else. It took 2 months of thinking about it.
I think that was more a statement on the amount of drawings that I was doing of him. I think he was just sort of trying to be amusing, saying, "Oh, I really worked on this thing for months." I think it was more. Anyway, that's what that was about, I think.
Yeah, it could be.
Well, you guys, but you and Andy had such a different working process. You had the more classic when you're talking about the tools you use to measure his nose and everything, where Andy was really taking Polaroids, turning them to acetates, and he would work on the acetates to get facelifts to people and thin the neck or get rid of wrinkles and stuff. So it's a different process. But I look back fondly when you were artist in residence at this, and then after you did Andy's portrait, it was Arnold Schwarzenegger walking around shirtless.
Here we are.
Here he is.
Speaking of the devil, because it happened more or less at the same time that you were working on on your portraits of each other, right?
Well, it was through a guy I remember when Vincent, you and I talked, Bobby Zarum, who was sort of a publicity black, who I think was promoting the picture Pumping Iron. And Arnold at that point, could barely speak English. I mean, he was sort of completely naive, but very, curious about things. And it
promoting himself.
Well, yeah, and of course, I loved the fact that when finally I said, "Well, I'll do something of him," and he posed in my little area there, and of course, all these sort of drag queens and whatnot, when they heard Mr. Universe was at the factory, I mean, it was just it was a flood of just everybody, and Arnold not really quite aware of what the hell was going on, and I mean, there's one incident that I have to recount. I mean, I don't know how.
It's okay.
If I can go on, but one day, and it was 4:30 in the afternoon, and Arnold had been posing for me, and he was sort of pulling on his clothes, and Andy knocked on the sort of opening I had, said, "Hi, Jamie. There's a really cute person here that Arnold would really like to meet." And so I thought, well, you know, I'm finished working. So in he comes. Well, of course, in comes Victor Hugo, who was this character who was Colston's lover and always brought the most unbelievable types down there when I was there. And behind him, he brought in this statuesque woman dressed in a silk taffeta. Well, this is 4:30 in the afternoon at Union Square, but anyway. And he came in and Andy was saying, oh, isn't she cute? She's so wonderful. Jamie, you should draw her. She's so wonderful. And so this woman sat down, Victor speaking, I assume it was Spanish. Her name, Victor, was Pontessa something.
Picasso.
Patasa, exactly. And who I gather was, well, anyway, this, so of course Arnold's standing there pulling on his clothes and he's starting to sort of make a move on Potessa, sort of say, where do you live and so forth. And he's saying, oh, you're so cute, snapping photographs like mad. I then sit down in front of this woman and start doing a drawing. I mean, she had this great long neck and rather amazing looking. And with that, Victor says something in Spanish. With that, she lifts the hem of her taffeta ball gown and exposes this erect penis. And so turns out she was a guy in drag, and a very famous drag. Yeah. Hadn't she posed for Salvador Dali and whatnot? Yes. And well, Arnold, of course, backs up against the wall of my enclosure, not quite knowing what to say. It was a rather remarkable moment. Well recorded by Andy in Polaroids that are at Stanford.
Those are those magical moments in the afternoon at Union Square, you know, 860 Broadway.
Yeah.
Anything could happen.
That's for sure. And so I ended up, and you know, at those drawings, I left a lot of the drawings there when I left the factory, and they ended up in Fred's estate. And so one of the drawings, of course, had Potessa and Arnold in the drawing. So I got a call from Schwarzenegger saying, we have to get rid of that drawing. I thought, that's when I realized he was serious about running for office. And I said, Arnold, it's going to be more of a problem if I start. They were coming up at Sotheby's or Christie's. And so finally I cut a deal with Sotheby's. There were a lot of them were unsigned, the life-size ones. So I said to Sotheby's, I would sign them if I could have the sketchbook. And Arnold was much relieved.
And he went on to have a distinguished career as a politician.
He certainly did, yeah. Phenomenal, you know, pretty amazing. So and then Andy did a silk screen of Arnold, didn't he, Vincent?
I can't remember. I think he
did.
He definitely shot him, and there's multiple of these images.
It doesn't necessarily mean he finished the portrait, because he did Maria Shriver's portrait.
Right.
And I don't think he did, because he did Stallone's portrait. I don't know if I'd have to think about that, because I almost want to say yes, but there's something telling me he didn't. It wasn't just because Andy took a number of Polaroids, if you did not equate to having your portrait done.
Always.
Also meant if you had a commission, did you pay for it? Sometimes you would, you know, if he did do portraits of, let's say, Jerry Hall and some other women, because he didn't want to do the, you know, Beautiful Women again in the late, that was like the mid 80s. Jerry, because she was on our TV show a lot, but he generally, you had to commission, you had to pay.
So Vincent, here we have a sequence of images illustrating a 1983 photo shoot with Pia Zadora, and on the right there's the Polaroid that is of her that we have in our collection. And we get a sense of Andy's collaborative process, right? Because the actress is taking cues from Warhol and his assistants, but at the same time, she is meant to feel like she is also contributing every step of the way. And I know you've mentioned that was kind of deliberate in terms of how Andy handled his sitters, but could you talk briefly about that aspect of the portrait experience?
Well, it's first of all, it's to make the subject relaxed, and, you know, basically you see Pia's wearing a cloth wrapped around her. Andy generally didn't like women wearing any jewelry. He always wanted to elongate the neck, and in the beginning at 860 Broadway, he was putting makeup on the mostly women's portraits, but we did have it. You see in the one that there is a makeup artist we brought in because it was like kabuki makeup because it was the white in the face, so all the harshness of the flash would be diffused when you make an acetate from the Polaroid. So he would do what 30, 40 Polaroids, and you can see Rupert Smith and Jay Shriver, his assistant at that time, and I think Benjamin it looks like. But yeah, so he would spend a lot of time. We would all try to make, everyone would try to make the subject relax. That's why a lot of times they were invited to lunch before the portrait sitting with, so they would meet other people. And but again, he did make people feel like they were participating. If he would ask the woman getting a portrait, oh, well, what color do you like? Oh, do you like this portrait? He knew exactly what he wanted, but he asked them so they would feel like they were participating. He was the final editor of what he wanted.
And then he would paint him or her exactly as he wanted.
Yeah, because there were times where Ina Ginsburg, who was a society matron in Washington D.C. big time in the 70s, she was a blonde, but when he did her portrait, it was delivered. She had black hair. She flipped out and returned the portrait, and Andy had to do it again. But we always took the position it's the artist's prerogative, artistic license, whatever. That's how we saw her, as not a blonde, but a black haired. So.
And he changed it.
He did finally for her. Other times there were only a few times that people were difficult because generally Fred would, we'd say, well, there was one time where a man came in, he wasn't very attractive and he wanted 60s kind of color. So, but because he was kind of overweight and had a beard, Andy did 4 smaller portraits to make the 40 by 40. So when he arrived to see the end result, he didn't like it at first. So we basically said, why don't you take the portrait to your hotel and live with it overnight and call us in the morning. And then generally they realized Andy was right. That's how it should be. So yeah, we try to be as accommodating as possible, but there was another one, Mr. Lefrak, his portrait was done, from a photograph this time. And the family came in and said that didn't look like him, but how could it not look like him? It was from a photograph. So it was the eyes. Andy had to rescreen it 2 or 3 times. And then of course there's the Dolly Parton who commissioned her portrait for Sandy Gallen as a present. And Andy did 2 versions and they were all rejected.
And it's one of his greatest portraits.
I know, they're fantastic.
Oh my God.
We met with her. She came to visit Andy when she was crossing over from country western to pop. And we had a great time with her. And then she wanted to have this commission. So I got on the phone with her, gave her the drill of how much it would cost and what would need to be done. I think Andy was out in LA and photographed her and she was terrific. And then I think maybe because she was losing weight at that time, but he did one with a close crop, one further back. But I think there's 4 or 6 of each of the versions. And it's a shame because they are wonderful.
Oh, they're classic. Alice Walton has one of them, and I think it's one of the great portraits.
Yeah.
But in a way, Andy seems to me had a way of kind of leveling the playing field with respect to beauty. In those kind of pre-Photoshop days, it is well known how he would literally crop the double chins and remove wrinkles and bags underneath the eyes. And essentially every woman who posed for him, whether it be famous starlets or queens and princesses, could be as beautiful as everyday person could be as beautiful as these other women that he painted, which was, I think, that was brilliant.
He wanted everybody to look like a movie star, females, but males the same way. Males, generally, you had your hand on your chin, or you had a cigarette in your hand or a cigar. He had classic moves, poses, but he did facelifts on acetate.
For everybody, every single one of his sitters.
Yeah.
And yet he was, I think, equally as concerned with his own beauty, his own image. You mentioned wearing the wigs, applying makeup or the pimple cream, as he called it, very concerned with putting his best self forward. I wondered if y'all could talk to me a little bit about what you remember about his own vanity.
Well, I think, as I always understood, he spent about an hour before he went out every morning putting all this stuff together.
it was all part of his artwork too. He created his own person became his artwork. I mean, you see you see them from the early 70s. I remember when he came into it was then at 33 Union Square West. He came in with one eyebrow white and one black, and it was like I couldn't look at him for a while because it was like, who am I looking at? Which eyebrow? But he worked, and then later you realized that he had different wigs for different times. He had a day wig and an evening wig. So they were slightly different color, and they looked better. And then when he became a male model in 1980, he started cutting his wigs really short. So he was very much involved in his. And if you read his book, his philosophy book, which is brilliant. You get his idea about how he felt about his looks and the pimples and what people, just there's description. Andy always got attacked personally. They forget about his artwork. They would attack him personally. That would part of it be his physical appearance. So he took all that in stride, but it became part of his artwork. And he, if you look at the different decades, how he changed it, how he dressed, how he looked, the wigs had changed, and into what now they call the fright wig from 1986. It's incredible. But he was very concerned about it. And then, the ones in drag, which are, I think, extraordinary. So
yeah, we see a few of them here.
yeah.
I'm going to open it up to questions in a moment, but I have one that I think is very opportune for this image. Ray Di Pietro from Nashville says that of course, they're very fortunate to have a portrait at Cheekwood. Jamie, he wanted to know if Cheekwood commissioned the painting.
No, they did not. And I remember Andy and I went down to Nashville and were feted there as they showed the portrait for the first time. It was a rather odd place to have this portrait. I still can't quite figure it out, but we had a great time going to the Grand Ole Opry and so forth, and it was all very, very, very kind of exciting. But no, it was not a commission at all. I just did the portrait really just because he just intrigued me. So I just had to record everything about him. It just, as I said, became this obsession, and I had no idea that it would ever be bought or sold or whatever. And I still have hundreds of drawings of them that I've just kept myself.
Yeah, they're spectacular, as we have seen. Okay, Vincent, I wanted to ask you one last question about this idea of artistic exchange, since it's another underlying theme of the exhibition. Here I'm showing our audience multiple works by Bridgette Berlin. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about her, not her, I know that she was very close to him as a friend, but if you could talk briefly about their artistic exchanges, because here we have a case where I think she was tremendously original, especially with the Polaroid, and her originality, in my view, exceeds his originality or comfort with that medium.
Well, Andy started taking Polaroids in the early 60s before he knew Bridgette. They had a completely, I think, basically a different style. Bridgette did have the Polaroid camera that could do double exposures. So she was really experimenting with that. And that's where she was a real pioneer, as you can see with the double exposure of Andy's flower print and, their various people and friends. So she always prided herself having a better Polaroid camera than Andy did. So I always looked upon Bridgette as Andy's muse for Polaroid photography and audio tapes, because they both taped each other constantly. And then they had the game of who has the original tape. And there's the famous story, but I consider famous, when she did a show of her Polaroids at Heiner Friedrich's gallery in Munich. She was over there for a few months, and she called Andy from Munich. Now this is the 70s. That's not so. This phone call lasted. Andy was able to cook a chicken in the oven. So that's what, 2 hours. So Bridgette was on the phone for at least 2 hours, and I have documents that show Heiner's correspondence with Bridgette, complaining about the size of the phone bill that would have to be deducted against sales of her artwork. But Bridgette was a force of nature. She was an extraordinary woman who could have been anybody, done anything she wanted to do, but she really lived her life, including she didn't really feel that she was an artist, but she actually was. She was respected by all the artists that were hanging out at Max's in the front room, not the back room, from Bryce Martin, Robert Rauschenberg, Larry Poons, Chamberlain, Larry Rivers, Peter Beard. I mean, she was one of the guys in that sense. She wasn't, she said she was never a groupie. So she really held her own. De Kooning, she met all these people. She was incredibly creative. And they fed off each other. But again, like Bob Colichello said in our film Pie in the Sky, the Bridgette Berlin story, they were like a married couple. She's the only one who could yell at him like the way she did when she started working on a daily basis. And they had a perverse way of dealing with each other. Andy would give her, oh, here, Bridgette, here's a Cartier watch. Well, the Cartier watch was a man's watch, and she wanted a woman's watch. So she'd get mad, and she didn't really like his artwork. She'd rather get, her eyelids done or get a vacuum cleaner or whatever besides getting any artwork. Most of us would accept gladly Andy's paintings and or prints, but it was perverse. It was great. So, I mean, his whole idea, he really loved her, and she was, a natural on camera, which I learned when I used to videotape her in the 70s. But they really did a lot of idea exchanging, but they were different people. And, she was a muse. Mm-hmm. And they really, they talked every day on the phone.
Thank you. So one last question for you, Jamie. Similarly, over the years, Andy has persisted in finding a way back into your work. He appears in several of your Sea Watchers paintings, for example. I'm showing one over here, done in 2009, following the death of your father, Andrew. And then here he is again in this fantastic diorama, Factory Dining Room, which is kind of part living painting, part dollhouse, part miniature portrait, where we see a three-dimensional Andy next to his dinner guest. And that, I think, is kind of the perfect segue for one of the questions that we have from the audience, and it's for either of you. Can you remember a dinner party or occasion where you sat in almost silent, open-mouthed amazement at the famous people that you found yourself hanging out with? Or did you always just take those things in stride?
But we would never be sitting at a dinner table with our mouth hanging out, not saying anything, because you had to be a good talker to be with Andy. That's he part of being accepted by him. There's a whole thing in the philosophy book. There's about beauties and talkers. He actually really liked talkers more than beauties, because you learn that, and you sink or swim if you took you out. I'd be his walking stick sometimes when I was first in the early 70s, and he wouldn't tell you where you're going, but you better start working the crowd, and that means talking. So you would never sit at a dinner table. You could be with Mick Jagger, you could be with, one time it was Otto Preminger at an opening, and I was asked to sit next to him and his wife. And, and he appreciated the fact that you could carry on an intelligent conversation with people, having not just met them. So I don't think any of us who were close to him were startled by it was extraordinary. I mean, I look back I met so many great famous people through him that I thought I'd never, ever, ever meet.
He still so resonates with me, because I realized that Andy was really the first serious painter that I met, other than my father or the ghost of my grandfather. So it had a huge effect on me. I mean, my father, there were imitators of him and so forth, and all uninteresting things. Whereas and Warhol thing, I never found him. I know Bob has sort of created this portrait. He was manipulative, and that whole Drella thing where he was a combination of Cinderella and Dracula. I never saw that, and I mean, yeah, I found him an incredibly sweet, kind person who was childlike. And I mean, it was during the period I think he and Jed were living together. Jed was probably the sweetest man that ever lived. And so I think that may have been, I don't know, I don't buy the Drella thing, but
Well,
it's a, you
the Drella comes from the Silver Factory, you know, combination of Dracula and Cinderella. And I don't know who coined it, whether it was Lou Reed or John Cale or somebody else, but I agree, because when I didn't know Andy in the 60s, I mean, I met him in 69. He was, you know, I looked at him as a second father. So, you know, he knew how to push people's buttons if you were close to him. He could set things off, but he could be mischievous. But he was a very generous person. But you had to really, it's hard to explain who Andy is to everybody, because Andy is so different to everybody. You could put 5, 10 people in a room, and they all have separate ideas of who Andy was. And that
know,
will never stop. I mean, but
and I loved, of course, I loved the fact that he was ill at ease. I mean, that always appealed to me too. That he was just basically ill at ease. And
where? In Chatsford?
no, but I mean, his silences and his sort of, I mean, yes, he chat like mad if you knew him.
That was his public persona, but he was very shy. When we started doing our own TV show, he improved enormously in the first 2 years, because he really enjoyed being the host of his own show and then doing links. But he was shy. And I know when Saturday Night Live wanted him to host live, I told the 2 writers who came, Nelson Lyons, who was an old friend of Andy's, and Terry Southern, the writer, to ask Andy to, you know, live. And I said, that's not going to happen, because Andy will stand on stage, turn red, and not say a word. So I said, instead of doing it live, why don't we videotape Andy, and we'll, you know, you can buy it, and if you don't like it, don't buy it and don't put it on. But they did 3 one-minute pieces where Andy was brilliant in it, but he had to be in control, because he was this shy person. But so the silence was also, that was part of his public persona, because if he trusted you, he was actually a very good conversationalist.
No, he cut his head off. Yeah, I agree.
And that's why he talked to Bridgette in the morning to find out what's, you know, and he talked to Pat, giving her his diary. And no, but he also talked to people, and he was very curious, and he loved gossip. And if you could feed him a good story, he was there for it. So, and he enjoyed being around people, but though he was extremely private, no one was allowed, basically. When he moved to the 5070 66th Street, very few people got inside. It was a beautiful home that Jed Johnson decorated.
I'll take this opportunity to just answer one question that is from a viewer who was asking whether or not, Jamie, you had painted Archie, and indeed you have. This is a portrait of Archie Warhol, not necessarily of Andy, but of Archie, and you've painted many portraits of Archie.
Well, Archie was with him all the time, and was, I mean, he adored Archie, and Amos also. He had another dachshund, the 2 of them, and so this, I felt I had to do an official portrait of Archie Warhol, and which is what this is.
That's great. It's nice, because Archie was a great dog.
Well, what happened when Jed died? I mean, what happened to Archie and Amos? I mean, did somebody take them? I never could find out.
Jed died in, terrible Flight 800.
Yes.
Amos might have been gone already.
Right.
Okay. Archie was the last to go. Amos first.
Right.
He would, whether it would have been Alan Wasenberg, Jed's boyfriend at that time, but when Jed and Andy broke up in 1980, they split. The time. The dogs would be with Jed. It was dual custody after that. Fred was the broker of that divorce. But the dogs always stayed together. The funny thing about Archie Andy would take Archie everywhere, to the Italian restaurant Bellatos, which allowed Archie in. Once Amos came along, then Archie didn't want to go out as much. They stayed home together, and then Andy used Archie as the ploy. Andy couldn't possibly go to London because of the quarantine, about 6 months quarantine of dogs. He could go to Paris though.
I love it.
Jamie, I have a question from Leslie Foster in Maine. She wants to know if Andy ever visited you in Maine, and did Phyllis meet him? If so, what was that experience like?
Andy never came to Maine. So no, he did not. And he certainly knew Phyllis, yes, because when he would come to the farm, I mean, we were together on the farm and so forth. So, and Phyllis sort of, I mean, she was at the time too, I was painting Rudolf Nureyev. And so she was totally obsessed with Nureyev. And so I think she sort of gave Andy short shift. But anyway, they certainly knew one another.
Let's see, Ling asks if either of you could ask him one more question, what would it be?
Ask Andy one more
Andy.
question.
Mhm.
Oh my God, I can't even imagine. I just am still so saddened that he's not around. As I said, he would have been a wonderful old man. I mean, just
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, there's so many questions, and I think that who, you know, Jamie, do you remember the awful Sunday morning when Andy died? I got the phone call from Fred, you know, my worst nightmare coming true because I'd been worried about Andy in the hospital all weekend. But Fred and I were at Andy's house on 66th Street, and the door was open, and you walked by. You remember?
Yes, I went in. Yes, I
Yeah,
remember.
did you already know that Andy had died? Had you found out? I don't
Yes,
think.
I'd had, and I was sort of just
That puts it,
devastated.
that would have to put it around noonish because Fred had tried to get the hospital, New York hospital, and to keep the press away from the fact that he died because we needed to phone people who were close to Andy. So that was just a horrible thing. But I remember you coming by and you came in and saw us.
Well, I live just down the street. I 1 East 66. I still have an apartment there.
That moment I will never forget.
Yeah. Still devastates me.
Yeah. So it's hard to answer a question. What would be the last question? We talk to every day. When you see somebody every day and you're working on ideas and doing this and doing that, you know, my question to Andy lying in the coffin in Pittsburgh, it was, isn't it time to leave to go back to New York? That wasn't going to be the case.
Then maybe let's rephrase this because it's another question that multiple people among our audience have. What do you think is Andy's most important legacy?
Well, to me, it's his work. I mean, his paintings, I think they speak volumes, and I still think he's ahead of his time, and he knew exactly what he was doing. I mean, there was no accident in his work. I mean, he knew exactly what, and I think he knew he was going to would resonate forever. I mean, I think he was convinced.
Yeah, I agree. He was a total visionary. One of the people who, you know, put on this earth at the right time in the right place, and he knew it.
I thought that Whitney show, that final room of the Mona Lisa sort of faded into the wall, I thought was just extraordinary, really phenomenal.
Beautiful. And so I had these two slides which kind of speak to that a little bit because he was visionary in that sense. He kind of foretold of our fascination with celebrity, and nowadays also kind of selfie culture and social media and all of that immediate gratification. But then he was not afraid to call out America for its violent roots, right? And so even explored the violence that was perpetrated onto his own body, and he was a genius like that. Could you all, or maybe Vincent, talk about what you remember about Warhol's worldview or how he structured his looking?
Well, he was the master of understanding media. You know, whether, you know, he was doing sound bites before that term was used. I think he saw like I said earlier, he saw the world so differently than most people in interpretation. So I don't know. I mean, it's, what's the question again? I'm going off on.
Talking about how his fascination with media, that's one kind of part of what he.
Well, he saw, you know, what was coming. I mean, he was the only one who actually embraced Ron Galella, the, you know, king of the paparazzi in the 70s, when everybody was saying he was a pariah. It was, you know, he was accepted, bringing, you know, the PR people. Bobby Zarin would push him out, and Andy would let him in. He understood what was happening in this culture, and so the reality television, we were doing television in some sense, reality television back in the 70s and early 80s,
Mhm.
but he saw that coming, for better or worse.
Mhm.
He saw, but he embraced it all. He could, people, he would have, people always say, what would he be doing today? And you can't speak for Andy, but I think, something like Instagram or something like that, he would be fascinated with because of the instant gratification and what can be done with it. I mean, he did Debbie Harry's portrait on a computer, the Commodore Amiga, which my wife Shelley and I went with him and Debbie Harry to Lincoln Center. So he really cared about doing that. And he spent 2 weeks or 3 weeks with technicians from Commodore. He would have been doing all sorts of stuff, but he was fascinated with the world. Again, the curiosity was, nonstop, and he wasn't judgmental. And that's why he embraced anybody who was creative. And he loved other artists, and people paint so many different portraits of his personality. It really gets difficult, and because most people are talking second or third hand and never knew him, and it's really it's always refreshing, like having this conversation with Jamie, who can speak firsthand, because there's a difference between firsthand and what you've read or what you've interpreted, even based on Andy's diaries. It's a different thing. What he said doesn't mean what he meant sometimes.
That's why it's been such a rare treat to have you both in the room with us, and we're so appreciative. I think we're about at the end of our session, but there's one question that we always like to ask, because a lot of our audience are college students or young emerging artists who are just kind of finding their own path in own kind of career path. What advice would you have for an artist who is starting out today or considering pursuing art professionally?
Just to paint, to work. I mean, just work at it. I mean, you can't just sort of ride along. I mean, Warhol was an obsessive worker. I mean, it wasn't all fun and games.
He was a workaholic, and you hit it right on the nail, right on the head. He would have said, just work, keep painting, keep working. And he didn't believe in, he was definitely a workaholic, and you can't, and how he gained his notoriety and everything is he worked all the time. From a commercial artist, he was doing fine art, he was working. If you look at the body of work from the 50s, and then when he breaks through in 1962, I think, and he always encouraged people. And if you go to Lou Reed and John Cale did the Drella in honor of Andy after he died, and there's a whole song about when he tells Lou Reed to keep writing songs. He would want you to work 24 hours a day. But you nailed it, Jamie, as an artist. Exactly, work.
Okay, so one last question. What in your opinion made Andy the happiest?
God, Vincent, what made him the happiest?
Well, I found out by giving him presents, because a lot of times he wouldn't open the present you gave me. You'd just tear the corner of the present and look and see what it is, and then put it away. Tins of crackers, 100% cotton turtlenecks. He would wear them. That made him happy. But that's not really answering the question. What made him happy is working and being, recording, and people think, and maybe you think, there's different interpretations. He was not an unhappy person. So he had his self-doubts like everybody, but he questioned life and everything else. But what made him happy was being around interesting people. He was this energy force that attracted people. I'm going to repeat myself, but people came to New York to come to Andy's studio to be and see him, to meet him. It was a huge vacuum after Andy died. Who was the one who was going to, carry the torch? But what makes him happy? You'd have to ask him. And Heiner Friedrich talks to him on the phone all the time. You know who I'm talking about, Heiner Friedrich, a wonderful art dealer. But he always, over the years, since Andy's gone, he goes, "Vincent, I've just spoken to Andy." And then he tells me what Eddie thinks about with this and that.
Oh, yeah, some unique insights, I guess.
Isn't that
Yeah, no,
great?
it's great. It's great because Heiner was a major champion of Andy in his artwork
That's wonderful.
and still is.
Right.
Well, thank you both so much. And I have to apologize to our audience. We have, 20 more questions that we couldn't get to. And I appreciate I appreciate you both being with us and how engaged our audience was, because I'm sure that they, as we have been, have just experienced this incredible treat. And we're very happy and so honored that you both accepted to be with us tonight. So thank you all so much. Really appreciate your time. And I hope to have opportunities to see you both again soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Great, Vincent. Wonderful seeing you.
Hey, Jamie, let's talk on the phone tomorrow.
Okay.